Cancer is one of the top causes of death in our society, right behind heart disease. And the most common ways that we treat cancer is either by cutting it out surgically, or we blast it with radiation, or we poison it with chemotherapy. So pretty aggressive, pretty invasive treatments. But a completely different idea has been popping up in the scientific community. What if we can just starve cancer? You see, cancer cells have a different metabolism. They metabolize glucose differently, for example, through slightly different pathways, and they take up more glucose. They are more glucose hungry. This phenomenon is known as the Warburg effect, after the scientist that described it, Otto Warburg. He was a pretty interesting character. He got the Nobel Prize in 1931 after being nominated for it 36 times previously and not getting it. That's a lot of fake smiles and slow claps. And the Nobel Prize goes to not Otto Warburg. So scientists had this idea. If tumor cells are so glucose hungry, maybe we can just starve them by reducing glucose availability, maybe by reducing carbohydrates in the diet. This idea is known as metabolic therapy, and it's a fascinating idea. It's a great idea. Of course, it's just an idea until we actually demonstrate it in patients. This is one big takeaway. It doesn't matter how beautiful the model is, it always hinges on demonstrating, on testing in human patients. Because, for example, there's some evidence that tumor cells, at least some of them, are also able to use fat as a source of energy. Also some evidence that at least some tumors are able to use ketones. This matters because depending on the type of tumor and its metabolism, if we're reducing carbohydrate in the diet, typically we're increasing fat. And if it's a ketogenic diet, a very low carb diet, we're increasing ketone bodies. So depending on the type of tumor, we could accomplish nothing, we could make it worse. So this always needs to be tested in human patients. There's also a lot of lab data in mice, for example, showing that ketones in some contexts can slow down tumor growth. But there's also some data in mice showing that ketones in some contexts can accelerate tumor growth. So we never jump from mouse data and ideas to the conclusion in humans. We always test and demonstrate. So a brand new study that just came out a few days ago did exactly this. They set out to test this idea. Researchers from Greece, in collaboration with Professor Thomas Seyfried from Boston College, took 18 patients with a form of brain cancer called glioblastoma. And this is a pretty tough form of cancer. The prognosis is not good. Life expectancy after diagnosis is typically months to a few years. So it's a tough one. All these patients were going through regular medical treatment. So chemotherapy, radiotherapy, surgery for those that had indication. And then in addition to that, they were all advised to start a low-carb diet, and specifically a very low-carb diet, a ketogenic diet. So ketogenic diets, as most people know, are very low in carbohydrate, very high in fat. And in this study, they used a form of ketogenic diet called Mediterranean ketogenic diet, sometimes also called Keto Med, which focuses on healthy fats like olive oil, olives, avocados, nuts and seeds, fatty fish, with the main source of protein being fish and seafood, and some lean meats like chicken as well. So this alleviates one concern that people sometimes have with low-carb diets, because they often lean on less recommended forms of fat, the lard and the bacon and whatever else. Although in this case with this type of tumor, because the prognosis is so tough and they have survival time that is so short, I think it's less of a concern. The plaque buildup over the long term is the least of their worries, unfortunately. And in fact, the study reports that the participants had no dyslipidemia, so their cholesterol, their ApoB didn't shoot up, which is something that we sometimes see on low-carb diets. But here, because they are leaning on these healthier fats, it's expected that that won't be seen as much. The sample menus recommended to the participants included foods like tuna, sardines, salmon, feta cheese, green salads, olive oil, small amounts of fruit, and tahini, which is a paste made from sesame seeds. So it's important to understand all 18 patients were advised the same diet. So this isn't a randomized trial. There's no randomization. There's no control group per se. So this is what we call a case series. It's an observation, a description of a group of patients, but without a trial design. So it's important to understand that for interpretation, and we'll come back to this. Also, as we said, they didn't do the diet instead of treatment. They were all going through the treatment, and then the diet was advised on top of that. The caloric intake of the participants ranged from 1,500 to 2,300 calories a day, and this was ad libitum, so they weren't told to restrict calories. This is what they reported eating spontaneously. In average, there was weight loss in the participants, especially in the beginning, 3 to 5 kilos approximately. They weren't told to lose weight. That's just what happened spontaneously. And again, because we don't have a control group, we can't say that the weight loss was because of the diet, although that's very possible. We often see weight loss with low-carb diets. But because we don't have a control group, we don't really know. Maybe it's the diet, maybe it's some other aspect of the treatment, the chemo or something like that, or the cancer itself. Who knows? Their goal was to get patients to stick to the diet for at least 6 months. And out of the 18, a third did. So 6 patients stuck with it for 6 months or more. The patients tested their level of ketosis themselves with test strips that you dip in urine. So they did that at home and reported the levels. They measured them daily. And these 6 patients that stuck to the diet reported very high levels of ketones. So everything indicates they were in deep ketosis. So because there is no control group, what the investigators suggest in the paper, in the study that they wrote, is they look at a comparison between the 6 patients that stuck to the diet and the 12 that didn't. So in the compliant group that stuck to the diet, out of those 6 patients, 4 survived for 3 years or more. So that's 66%, 4 out of 6. In the non-compliers, 1 out of the 12 made it to 3 years. So that's 8%. Average survival in the non-compliers was 15 months, and it was 47 months in the compliers. So 3 times longer. And several patients were still alive at the time that they wrote the paper, especially in the compliant group, so the average is going to be even longer. So this is an exciting result. It's an encouraging result. Maybe these diets can indeed help these patients and improve the prognosis of this condition, which is so rough. Now, we have to be cautious always with the case series. First of all, because of the size here, the sample size, 6 patients sticking to the diet. So that's always going to be a preliminary result. Second, because of the experimental design, everybody gets recommended the same diet. Some people choose to stick with it, some people don't. That introduces a number of biases. It's fundamentally different from assigning the diet to one group and another group gets assigned another diet, right? Or gets assigned nothing at all in a randomized trial. Very different interpretation. Maybe the patients who can't or won't stick to the diet also are less rigorous about their regular medical treatment, their chemotherapy, their radiotherapy. Or maybe they are less compliant with general lifestyle recommendations, smoking and exercise, all these things, and maybe they're less healthy in general. Or maybe the patients who had more aggressive forms of cancer, more difficult cases to begin with, who were sicker, who were less hopeful, who were kind of more broken, were less likely to stick with the diet, had less energy left, or had less hope that it was going to make a difference. In fact, when we look at the list of participants among the compliant group, it was much more common that they got the type of surgery called total resection. So you cut out all of the cancer that you can see that is detectable. Whereas in the non-compliant group, and the surgeries took place before the diet was assigned, in the non-compliant group, it was more of a mix. Some got the total resection and some got the partial resection. Partial resection usually means you can't take out all the tumor, maybe because of the areas of the brain that it affects, or surgically, you just can't get to all of it. And we have substantial evidence that the total resection has a better prognosis than the partial resection. So this is a pretty obvious confounder that complicates interpretation. If we had a very large number of participants, thousands of people or something like that, you can do a statistical adjustment to try to see if that goes away. But with 6 people, I don't think that's possible. This is not to say that it didn't work. Maybe it's still the diet delivering the benefits. We just need to be cautious and take a case series, any case series, with a grain of salt, always because of these methodological issues. In fact, if you've seen our videos on the reversal of heart disease that we published a while back, there was an identical situation. There's a famous study when we talk about Reversal of Heart Disease by Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn. That's also a case series. It's similar. He also compares the patients who stuck to his diet to the ones that decided or couldn't stick to his diet. And as we discussed in that video, identical concern and identical grain of salt had to be used. Interesting because the diets are almost polar opposites. In Dr. Esselstyn, it's a very high carb, low fat diet, and here it's a very low carb, high fat diet. But regardless of the diet, the experimental design of a case series demands caution. It's very common to see case series in all kinds of areas of medicine describing very interesting observations in patients, and then when those things get tested in randomized trials, they flop. They don't work. Happens all the time, unfortunately. But some things from case series pan out and become important tools. So very important to validate and always take these things with a grain of salt. Now, the investigators try to figure out those 12 participants who didn't stick with the diet. They try to ask them why. And some of the reasons cited included the relatives didn't think the diet would make a difference. They didn't have any hope. Some patients reported not sticking with the diet because they didn't have a supportive environment. And finally, some patients cited financial constraints. So each one of these is a potential bias. If you don't have money to stick to the diet, suggests you're a lower socioeconomic status, you have less resources in general, maybe that affects your prognosis and your general state of health. If you don't have the support system, that might affect your health in general. So again, very exciting, very encouraging finding. We want to see a sizable randomized trial that really puts this to the test and decides, is this going to be a major tool going forward, or does it not work? I took a look at the databases that have trials that are ongoing, that haven't finished yet, or not published yet. And there's a number of trials ongoing, either recruiting or already in process, looking at this type of question. Low carb diets, ketogenic diets, and different types of cancer. So we're going to have more data, more information in the future. Hopefully this pans out. As the authors themselves wrote, larger studies will certainly be necessary. The relatively small sample size prevents definitive conclusions. And also, the number of patients in our study was small, but the results are encouraging and motivate us to plan studies with larger numbers of patients. Another thing that's important to know is that there was a lot of recurrence in these patients. Recurrence is when the cancer comes back. So it's been treated with chemo or it's been cut out and it comes back. It's detected again later. And that happened in 4 of the 6 patients in that compliant group. Now, one of those patients had stopped the diet, the cancer recurred, was detected again, and the patient went back on the diet. But 3 of the 6 were being compliant, were in ketosis, and the cancer came back, recurred. So why is that? Why do we see cancer recurring even though they're compliant? The authors suggest some possible explanations. One being that the ketogenic diet can't completely deplete the tumor from glucose. Another is that these tumors are usually feeding on other types of molecules as well, other substrates, glutamine being one. For example, glutamine is a type of amino acid that cancer cells often also use for energy. So all of that may contribute to an incomplete response. It's also important to bear in mind that regardless of how low carb you are, your glucose level is always kept above a threshold. There's always a physiological range. In fact, if you're below that, you're hypoglycemic. You could even be lethal if it's too low. So there's always 70-something milligrams per deciliter of glucose in your blood at any time, even when you're fasting. And there's some evidence that suggests that that's plenty, that that's all the tumor needs. So we'll see with more data and more understanding. So just to leave things really clear, in case you see these findings hyped out there on Podcast Nation, they didn't show a cure for cancer. It wasn't the diet instead of medical treatment. It was both. It wasn't all cancer. It's a specific type of cancer. We can't extrapolate because cancer is a very heterogeneous disease. It can look pretty different depending on the tissue, and even within the same tissue, different cancer types. And they also didn't look at cancer prevention. It's cancer management. All the patients already had cancer diagnosed. Okay, other questions that are left open that are really interesting for future research. If this is indeed confirmed to work, what is it about the diet that confers a benefit? Is it the restriction of carbohydrate? Is it the ketones themselves? Is it the weight loss? Because this gives us more options, right? If it's the ketones, for example, there's MCT oil drinks that can induce the production of ketones in one's body, even not being on a low carb diet. So maybe the patients who can't adhere to the diet, maybe that's another option. If it's the weight loss, you can offer a repertoire of options to patients that lead to weight loss that confer a benefit. So this broadens our options. Another really interesting question is, again, if this is confirmed, are these diets affecting cancer metabolism directly, or are they potentiating the medical treatment? Are they potentiating the effect of the chemotherapy or the radiotherapy? And that's unclear. And as I always try to emphasize, it's never about one isolated study. It's always about looking at big picture and totality of evidence. And in fact, this is not the first study looking at this question. In addition to a lot of lab data and animal data, there are case reports, so descriptions of individual patients on low-carb diets. There are other case series that were conducted previously as well, and there's even a couple of randomized trials on this question. The problem is, so far, these trials were either tiny or they had also some methodological issues. For example, there's one randomized trial that suggested a reduction of tumor size on a ketogenic diet, but it was also a very small number of patients, 9 patients on the diet in that trial. And also, it wasn't just a diet, it was a diet plus a drug that was inhaled. So I looked at it, it's hard to know what's doing what. The largest randomized trial I've seen on this question had 50 patients, and they found no significant effect of a ketogenic diet on survival or disease progression in that trial. But they only put the patients on the diet for a few days. I think it was 6 days on the ketogenic diet, and then following them for months after that off the diet. So obviously, this doesn't rule out that if you follow the diet for longer, there might be benefits. There's also a number of studies looking at low-carb diets in other types of cancer, but it's usually the same story. Very small numbers or methodological issues, no control groups. It's always a little funky like that. So it's preliminary data. We need one of these trials that really puts this on the map. And I don't think realistically that the guidelines are going to change until we have one of those trials that really puts the flag on in this field. Now, one thing is guidelines and standard of care, and something else is individual choice. And if I had a diagnosis of a glioblastoma, knock on wood, I would consider doing this diet. I would consider it seriously, understanding that the evidence is not very strong. We don't have compelling demonstration that the diet is going to improve outcomes. But the prognosis is so bad to begin with. The survival, life expectancy is so short. My thinking would be, what do I have to lose? And the evidence we have leans more towards benefits than harm. We do see some side effects in some patients, usually gastrointestinal, constipation, diarrhea. Sometimes they go away just with time on the diet. Other times they go away if the diet is discontinued. But we see those in some patients, not others. So I would certainly consider this. I would work with my doctor. It would be a joint decision. And I would absolutely not neglect my medical treatment. I would go through the chemo and the radio and the surgery if indicated. And on top of that, I would seriously consider the diet myself on the off chance that the effect is real. But this is a personal decision. It's case by case. For a lot more information on ketogenic diets and how do they compare to Mediterranean diets, we have a whole video going over that. I'll link that right here. And for comparisons between low carb and low fat diets in randomized trials, we have a whole video going over that. I'll link that right here. Check them out. I'll see you in there. Take care.